Hello and welcome to the My Ministry Mission podcast, where I'm taking you on a journey with me from unbeliever to disciple of Christ. As a Christian young in his faith, I'll share with you what I've learned as I seek a position of ministry in my life. I urge you to visit my website at myministrymission.com and to find me on Facebook at facebook.com/myministrymission. My name is Jason, and this is My Mission. Thank you for joining me in this episode. We're going to talk about the Book of Ruth, which is one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. It's also my daughter's middle name and has been a family name on my mother's side for generations. This episode is intended to give a general overview of the Book of Ruth and to set the stage for us to delve into the 4 chapters and 85 verses of this amazing but short story in our next episode. So, basically, general overview this episode. Next episode, part 2, will go chapter by chapter. The ESV Bible introduces the Book of Ruth this way. The Book of Ruth tells of a young Moabite woman who, out of love for her widowed Israelite mother-in-law, abandoned her own culture, declaring, "Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God." Ruth 1:16. Though she was destitute and needing to rely on the kindness of others, Ruth's disposition and character captured the attention of Boaz, a close relative of her deceased husband. Boaz fulfilled the role of kinsman redeemer and took Ruth as his wife. Ruth serves as a wonderful example of God's providential care of his people and of his willingness to accept Gentiles who seek him. Ruth was an ancestor of Christ. The author is unknown, but the genealogy at the end suggested that it was written during or after the time of David. All right, so that's the ESV introduction. The Book of Ruth is a pretty short book, and it takes place during the time of Judges after the conquest of Canaan, and sometime before 1050 BC. In fact, the Book of Ruth connects Judges with the Book of Samuel in the sense that the first verse points to the time of Judges and the very last verse points to King David in terms of the genealogy to come. The whole story of Ruth covers roughly 11 to 12 years if you consider the 10 years in Moab, several months in the Boaz fields, the night on the threshing floor, and then another year in Bethlehem. Now, as I said, we don't know who wrote this book, though some seem to believe that it might have been the prophet Samuel. Ruth and Esther are the only 2 Old Testament books to receive names from women. So that's kind of an interesting fact there. Okay, so the Book of Ruth is broken into 4 chapters for a total of 85 verses. Chapter 1 starts in Moab, provides kind of an introduction and gives some background on Ruth. Chapter 2 shows Ruth working very hard to survive in the fields of Boaz. Now, again, Boaz is a person. Chapter 3 is about love and redemption that begins on the threshing floor. And then chapter 4 is all about redemption, blessing, family, and genealogy. A little bit more on that later. There are a few purposes to this book. The first is to provide a biographical view of the religious ancestry of King David, something we don't get from the Book of Samuel's. Second, the book provides a contrast between the reproach brought on Bethlehem and Judges. And then the Book of Ruth also highlights the fulfillment of God's covenant promises through Judah at a time when the nation of Israel had completely lost their first king, King Saul, from the line of Benjamin. Finally, it demonstrates how God provides for the needs of his people both individually and as a nation in accordance with his covenant promises. So what are these covenant promises? Now, there are 5 of them, though only the first 3 are really relevant at this point. The first is a Noahic covenant. Now, if you recall in Genesis 9, after the flood that reset and renewed the blessing of God's creation, God makes a promise to never destroy all life with a flood again. In Genesis 9:11, it reads, "I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." The second is the Abrahamic covenant. In Genesis 12 and 15, God promises Abraham a land, descendants, and blessings. So Genesis 12, 2 through 3 reads, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you." So covenant number 3 is the Mosaic covenant. Now, at Mount Sinai, after God led the people of Israel out of Egyptian slavery, God makes another covenant. Now, this one has conditions, which sets the stage for the cycle of blessings and curse throughout the Old Testament. Now, you can find this in Exodus 19 and 24. I'll let you read that on your own. Covenant number 4 is a Davidic covenant. God promises a descendant of David will reign on the throne over the people of God, which becomes the basis for the hope of a Messiah. And then the 5th one is the new covenant. We should all be, as Christians, aware of that. This is, of course, where God promises to make a new covenant unlike any he has made with Israel. A covenant for the world that will bring the forgiveness of sin. This, of course, is Jesus. Now, since Ruth is the great-grandmother of David, I think it's safe to assume that God has not made any promises to David yet. Therefore, the covenants made by the time of Ruth were just the first 3, the Noahic, the Abrahamic, and the Mosaic. Hopefully that clears things up a little bit. There's a fair chance I just made it more confusing. I do welcome your feedback, so shoot me an email. So back to the topic at hand. Ruth is a Moabite, which were the people who were a persistent enemy of Israel. And we see Moab comes up several times. I mean, just a few examples are, Moab came from Lot's union with his oldest daughter in Genesis 19:37. Disturbing story. Go enjoy that one. Hundreds of years later, the Jews encountered opposition from Balak, king of Moab, through the prophet Balaam. You can find this in Numbers 22 through 25. Moab also oppressed Israel for 18 years during Judges 3, verses 12 through 20, under Elgon, king of Moab. Saul defeated the Amalekites, which includes Moabites, in 1 Samuel 14:47. The list goes on. It's this constant, persistent clash or conflict, whatever you want to call it, between Israel and Moab. So what's the point of all of this? I wanted to illustrate that Ruth, as a Moabite, was not born a Jewish woman, but was in fact from a nation that was in constant conflict with Israel. She was a Gentile who later became a Jew. Ruth was more than just an outsider. She would have been seen as the enemy. A Moabite was the worst of the worst, but she breaks social conventions and honors God better than some of the most devout Jews of that time. This becomes interesting when we really consider that she is part of the line of David. I've often heard people refer to the Book of Ruth as this wonderful love story, and it is. It truly is. But it's so much more. There are multiple themes running through this one short book, including integrity, themes on kindness, hard work, redemption, and truly believing that God blesses obedience. Now, there's another character in the story, too. I've mentioned him a couple times, a man named Boaz. Now, Boaz is a no-nonsense straight shooter, highly principled and very responsible. His treatment of the poor is often highlighted as a model of obedience in the Torah, as we'll see when we dig in more in the next episode. Now, there are some valuable lessons in this book that are relevant to us today. I'm going to try to go through them, and I'll try not to throw too many spoilers in, but I can't promise anything. So lesson number 1 is that there is hope even in the most devastating moments of our lives. Spoiler here, the Book of Ruth includes some very sad moments, the kind of events that could easily crush any one of us in the weight of despair. We see Ruth and Naomi handling things very differently. We all face this adversity in life, and it's easy to blame God. Why did God let this happen? Is a phrase I've heard before many times. There is no easy answer to this question, especially when you're facing significant loss. Finding hope is very hard, and when hope starts to slip away, it stops feeding our faith, which stops feeding hope. It's this terrible cyclical fall down the drain. So when we talk about this in more in the couple of weeks, I really want to highlight the 2 different ways of dealing with these devastating losses, the way Naomi deals with it and the way Ruth deals with it. So lesson number 2, I think, is we don't need to get stuck in our past if we trust God. Ruth was a Moabite. I mentioned what the significance of that. So in the beginning of this book, they are living in her home nation, which was a place that most Israelites didn't like, as you can imagine. They were forced to live there due to famine, and then they lost everything, like everything. Ruth could have stayed in her home nation with her family and probably been just fine, but she made a choice to go with Naomi to Bethlehem. The journey there must have been absolutely frightful and difficult because she declared she was leaving her family behind and moving forward in the service of God. How many times have you felt stuck in the past? How many times have you felt stuck in a moment of your history that you feel anchors you and demands your attention? When you feel trapped because of where you came from, stop looking at the past. Instead, look to God. Don't look to the future. Don't look at now. Look to God, and He will guide you to a much better future. We can't control what happens to us in this world. It's a broken world. but we have control over where we go when this life ends, and that's monumentally more important. When your confidence starts to waver, remember that God's promises are not wavering. Lesson number 3, doing what is right often takes great sacrifice. So doing what is right can be very difficult, which is why we are always drawn to that to doing what's easy rather than what's right. And we try to justify it. Doing right takes sacrifice, and sometimes it's a big sacrifice. Naomi told Ruth that she was free to leave, go back to her family, live a good life in Moab. But Ruth knew that wasn't the right choice. Ruth chose to go with her mother-in-law, showing dedication to Naomi and dedication to God. I mentioned this at the very beginning of the episode. She says, "Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God." Ruth 1:16. Ruth made this beautiful, selfless act an amazing example of Christ's love for us. This same Christ that would come from her bloodline many years later. And then finally, lesson number 4, openly sharing about your relationship with God will bring you closer in your own relationships. Maybe not all relationships, but most of them. Now, Ruth and Naomi shared great sorrow together, and they shared great affection for each other. They were so close to each other that we get kind of an understanding more about their relationship than them individually. It's a beautiful, wonderful blending of lives through the shared family, shared grief, and most importantly, a shared love of God. And at the very core of their relationship is faith. In our modern times, it seems easier to keep our questions, our thoughts about God to ourselves, and better to keep those unfiltered thoughts hidden. But openly sharing about God can bring you closer in your relationships. Naomi was angry and hurt and very open to Ruth about all of that, and as well as the joy and her faith in God. And it was this moment of honest doubt that deepened the foundation of the relationship. I think that's a good place to end this episode. It's a little bit shorter than I wanted it to be, but when I originally was going to do the Book of Ruth, I was going to do it in one episode, but I started making notes, I started going through the material, started reading, and I realized I was in trouble and I would have to break it up. So remember to come back in 2 weeks as we work through the 4 chapters and some things that I feel are important to this beautiful story. Now, I recommend you read the Book of Ruth between now and then, and please feel free to send me your feedback. Let's finish in a prayer. Lord, thank you for this day and for the blessings we all share. I ask that you please continue to bless the person listening to this episode and fill their hearts with the same faith, strength, and love you gave to Ruth. I ask you to continue to be there with us in our times of trouble in this broken world and guide our feet as we do our best to be more like Christ. If there is anyone out there who is struggling right now, I pray that you bring them peace, strength, and joy. And just remind them that you are always with us as a perfect Father. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you again for listening to this episode. If you have any questions or comments, I urge you to visit my website at myministrymission.com. You can click the contact button, or you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/myministrymission. Remember to pray and remember to love God and each other. My name is Jason, and this is my mission.